Let's take a look at some of the challenges that come with working with extremely thin gauge sheet metal. So, gauge is the standard by which sheet metal is measured, and it is a numerical system. Here we have a gauge wheel, and so on one side of that gauge wheel, it's showing us the common gauge measurements from 0 to 36. The larger the number, the larger the opening. The smaller the number, the smaller the opening. So a benchmark that you can think of as 16 gauge is very close to a 1/16 of an inch thick. But we can also cross-reference these wire gauges against decimals, because on the back side there's decimal equivalents describing the correspondence between that wire gauge size and the decimal equivalent of that. So that being said, the fact of the matter is that you know what? Let's go ahead and measure the gauge of this peanut can that I'm repurposing. So I'm going to take my wheel gauge and I'm going to rotate it around till I think I see something that looks right. And then I'm going to just slide it on and test fit. And it shouldn't be a force fit, but it should gently touch the side of your material on both sides. So this is measuring in at 0.0187. And if we flip that over, we can see it is saying that that is 26 gauge. So anything under 16 gauge, which is that sort of benchmark or standard that we talked about, anything under 16 gauge is going to be so easy to bend, or it will deform so readily that it renders center punching it means center punch is not a possibility, because the force of the center punch, even with a spring-loaded one like this, would have a tendency to deform or bend those thinner gauges of sheet metal. So, and we also know that the force that we had to use for self-drilling and self-threading fasteners is also too much force to be able to hold that material, to keep that material from deforming or bending out of the way. So one way around that is analogous to the way that we use the wooden support underneath our stock. But in this case, I actually have a wood form that I cut to size so that I could both form around that wooden form to get my shape, and I could also leave it inside of my form to provide support so that when I went to center punch that material, it has support underneath it so it's not bending or deforming. If that's not an option or a possibility for you, then we would like to, we also have the option of being able to use a hand punch like these. And these are relatively inexpensive. The sort of industry standard is called a Roper Whitney No. 5 Junior, which is a really high quality hand punch that gives you a set of a half a dozen of the most commonly used punch sizes. And the way that this minimizes the deforming of the material is that it has what's called a die that is providing support for that material as the punch pushes through it. So it is reducing the likelihood of that material deforming. So grip it, punch, open it up, it strips off, and there you have it. Nice, clean holes. You'll see, we'll go into more detail during the riveting demo on how to change out dies on a hand punch. We're also going to go into more detail about the cutting of sheet metal, right? So stay tuned for that upcoming lecture. Anyway, to get back to what we were talking about, Because this material is so prone to bending and I'm unable to effectively use a center punch on that, I might also find that I have limitations in terms of things like hand punches, which can only go in as deep as what's called their throat, right? And in this case, the stock is too narrow for me to actually be able to get the die side inside of that form itself. So what are my options? Well, I could buck it up on a piece of wood, or I could also use a step bit, or I could open up my form. I could open my form up, and this gives me access to be able to punch this hole, close the form up, transfer that mark over with something like a Sharpie, and then punch the other side, which is what I've done here. Once I've got those pieces organized or registered, then I can use some sort of clamp, like these needle nose locking pliers, and I can secure that material in place. Make this look easy. So I can line those holes up, and with locking pliers, now again, because the material is so thin, I'm not going to want to use a power driver. Thread cutting is easily enough done just by using a hand driver like this that's appropriately sized for the type of sheet metal screw you're using. And so I line my parts up. Okay, let's give this another shot. I've got my screwdriver with a number 1 tip. I have a number 6 by 5/8 of an inch sheet metal screw. I've got the work held in place with locking pliers. And let's see how we do. I've got hands so shaky that I could thread a sewing machine while it's running. And there we go. Let's see if we can draw that up a little bit tighter to close that little gap between the two sheets. And there we have it. We got that to pull up pretty tight. And now I can take my clamp off and go to the other side. I'm going to go ahead and just set that by hand now. I need to swap out my tip to a small slot for this guy. And here we go. And that draws those two sides up pretty tight. So bust out the old coffee cans and let's make some stuff, humans.